Alrighty, let's get started then, unless anyone has any objections. Today, we are here to talk about attachment and trauma in different alternative lifestyles. This is coming after a series of focusing on the book Polysecure by Jessica Fern, which talks about attachment, trauma, and consensual non-monogamy. And that book was something we were going through a little more in depth in Jaeger's group Prepare, the poly relationship processing group. But we could go on and on and on about the relation between attachment and trauma and go more in depth. And I also work with a mental health support group that wanted to go a little more in depth into the trauma topic. So that's what we're doing here today. So who am I? I'm Miss Cas. I am a public health specialist by profession. I have worked in public health organizations studying mostly infectious disease epidemiology, but also policy, quality assurance, that kind of stuff. And I do have a master's of public health. It gave me a big systems focus in my work. Now that I'm transferring more into a mental health side of public health. I'm in school to be a counselor in training. I do mental health, relationship health, emotional health education, not just within the kinky poly communities, but I do that for healthcare providers. I do that for educators and schools. I don't just contain my work to my community, which is poly and kink mostly. Identify as kinky, identify as leather, I identify as polyamorous, pansexual, and I was really excited when I was opened up to the topic of attachment theory from the lens of how Jessica Fern and Polysecure presents it, because it opened up a whole new world to how to apply it to our more unique, non-traditional lifestyles. So this is just what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be looking at a basic introduction into what is attachment theory. We're going to cover the aspects of attachment theory that focus on what is a safe haven and what a secure base means, both from like the childhood perspective, within infancy, and then throughout your life. Looking at the different attachment styles and how they present and change throughout our lives or different relationships. Going to look a little bit about what is trauma, the different types of trauma, different definitions for trauma. We're going to talk about why is attachment a valid response to trauma, because that's not something that you hear about as often when people talk about trauma things. The different forms of trauma and how they relate to attachment. And then we're going to wrap it all up with what's your next steps? Now you know this information, what are you going to do with it? How to heal from trauma in our non-traditional relationships using the concept of attachment. So starting off, attachment theory. Our Prepare group and the mental health group I run know a little bit about this. Some of you might have come across it in other settings as well. Attachment theory was started more than 50, 60 years ago by a researcher named John Bowlby. He was looking specifically at the attachment behaviors in infants. And why do infants act a certain way with their parents and caregivers as opposed to strangers? Why do they do those things, and why do they need strong relationships? And so Bowlby and other researchers looked at this and said, oh, well, this kind of makes sense. Other animals, when they're born, can walk on their own. They can feed themselves sometimes. They can generally take care of themselves, depending on how advanced of a species it is. But humans, when we're born, we are incapable of doing pretty much anything except for breathing, ingesting what goes into our mouths, defecating, that kind of stuff. We need a lot of help when we're babies. And the only way we can survive is by relying on our caregivers. And so if a caregiver isn't providing in a certain way, whether that's an emotional connection or feeding the child food, a wound can form that can be lasting across the lifespan. This wound will dampen how a child interacts with the world around them, how much they trust the world around them, how much they trust themselves too, because in infancy and childhood, you're developing your identity too. And you will oftentimes internalize all those different experiences that happen to you as a child. So one of the two big important things that they talk about in attachment theory, especially when they're talking about it from infancy, is something called secure base and something called safe haven. And these are two concepts that are very much related to each other, where the caregiver, whether that's mom, dad, grandma, aunt, uncle, random person that just happens to be close to you when you're growing up, they allow you this secure base to go out into the world to explore, where they know that someone's looking out for them and making sure that they're going to be safe. They're going to, delight with that child, watch over that child, help them in any ways they can. But caregivers also have to be a safe haven for children, where when something happens, like an environmental trauma, or a big natural disaster, a death in the family, something traumatic, then people need a safe haven to come back to where they can recover. Because we develop all this in infancy, we're developing it while our brains are maturing. And this isn't just an emotional, mental response. This is a physiological response. And if you experience a trauma as a child, like a natural disaster, your nervous system starts to get stimulated. And you don't really understand how to calm that down yet, especially when you're young. And the safe haven concept is that these adults in your life, or older siblings, or something like that, will help you calm your nervous system and process the trauma that's happened to you, so that you can, go forward again and keep exploring later on. So as attachment theory has been gone through over the years and researched, and we've come up with these 4 different attachment styles. These are generally the attachment styles you hear about when you take a test on what's my attachment style, or that kind of stuff. And these go not just in infancy and childhood, but they can affect you throughout your life. And, it's not static throughout your life either. You will change depending on your physical health. You will change based on what relationships are around you. So many different things. So this isn't something that's static. It can change all the time. But you tend to, have that specialty in one area or the other. So the 4 different styles that you'll see in attachment theory is secure, which is, the ideal. This is, when people are confident interacting and connecting with different people, but they're also confident on their own. They can reciprocate feelings. They are, not overly reactive to emotional stimulation, and they're resilient when new traumas and new crises come up in their lives. They're a little more able to bounce back because they have this security within them, or security within their, relationships. The 2 most common insecure styles are the anxious preoccupied, and then the dismissive avoidant. And, those are very, when you think about them, they sound very opposite of each other. The anxious preoccupied is all about that emotional hunger. They feel like they're lacking nurturing. They feel very turbulent inside. This is the style that you might think of as someone being needy and extra in need of attention in a relationship. Or they might, one of the strengths of an anxious preoccupied type is that they are able to detect when people's emotional states are changing, but unfortunately, they interpret that wrong and blame it on themselves most of the time. Dismissive avoidance, or as I like to say, the stereotypical dom-ly-dom that a lot of people think is actually a good way of living, is to be ambiguous and ambivalent and emotionally distant, that cold-hearted ice queen kind of thing. And it doesn't have to look that obvious. Sometimes it comes off as an air of extreme independence and confidence, but when you go a little deeper, it's really, they have a hard time connecting with people and trusting people around them. They've been hurt so many times by so many people that they rather just cut people out of their lives, not get close in the first place. And then later on, we realized there was a fourth category in attachment theory and attachment styles, which was fearful avoidant, or in childhood, they call it more disorganized attachment. In childhood, this will be a child that they see their parent come back after missing for a while and they're really excited, but then all of a sudden they get disorganized and they go to the opposite end of the spectrum and they start hitting their parents back and forth, back and forth. It's because they don't know what to think. And this is a smaller population, but it can be even, these are the people with the worst outcomes usually long term. They have this internal conflict back and forth, one foot on the gas, one foot at the brake at the same time kind of thing. So those are the 4 different attachment styles. There are tests out there to take that if you want to figure out what your attachment style and it's not obvious to you right away, they can be pretty insightful. So moving on then, from attachment to trauma. There's so many different definitions for trauma out there. In the mental health field, you'll see people focus solely on the disordered versions of trauma responses, especially regular old PTSD. PTSD is in the diagnostic manual in the United States, in Mental Health Diagnostic Manual, DSM. But some of these other ones aren't in there. Even complex PTSD, which is probably going to be most of what we're talking about when we talk about trauma going through this presentation, the latter portions of it. Complex PTSD isn't a recognized disorder in the American DSM. It is in the International Classification of Disease. The difference between PTSD and complex PTSD is how repetitive the trauma was. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is usually a single event or something within a contained time frame. Traditionally, we think of soldiers who went off to a combat zone and then came back from that experience with PTSD from the war zone they were in. And it was kind of contained to that incident. Complex trauma, most of the time we're talking about children who experience trauma before the age of 15, especially before the age of 6. People who experienced repetitive trauma during that time of their lives get some really deep wounds that can last throughout their lives, and it presents in multiple facets in multiple ways throughout their lives, and it can be pretty intense to deal with. So in the mental health field, some people think trauma is too much of a hot topic, that people are using the word trauma to talk about things that aren't severe enough to rise to the level of the trauma definition. When I'm doing my work, I like to use trauma as an umbrella term for any lasting negative impact from a wound. And so the original Greek origin of the word trauma is just wound, whether that's physical, mental, emotional, interrelational, any sort of thing like that. So when I talk about it, I'm generally referring to long-term lasting negative impacts from an emotional, mental, physical, spiritual wound. So it's a little more of an umbrella term for me when I talk about it. I like using it this way because I think traumatic experiences are a lot more common than we like to realize. And we'll talk a little more about that. And I think it's good to have a label for it, even if I'm talking more about lowercase t trauma, not the disordered PTSD versions. So when you think of being in a crisis or going through a traumatic event, a lot of people think of fight, flight, freeze, or just fight, flight as your options when you're in a negative crisis moment. You got that fight, you're going to be vigilant and get yourself out of the situation. There's flight, you're going to escape. And then freeze, which is just the shutting down. But there are other ways our body and our brain and our neurological system react to trauma that isn't just these three. There's that need for attachment, because remember how we said infants can't provide for themselves? Well, if they're going through trauma, they know inherently that the only way they're going to survive this is by relying on the people around them. And, it isn't as conscious. You don't realize necessarily that you're reaching out, the connection aspect. You're more reaching out because, I want you to change my diaper because I'm uncomfortable, that kind of thing. And this is something that we don't talk about as using as a response to trauma in a healthy way as often. But think about the times you've been through a crisis. Sometimes sharing the experience or just asking for a hug or help from another person is really what we need. And it helps soothe our nervous system, and our emotions and all those things. There's also the fifth reaction to crisis, which is submit or shame. This can be you can have a piece of each of these reactions. So a lot of the time you'll see a little bit of that submit shame in people who have been repeatedly traumatized on a cultural societal level, especially really poor people. If they go through a trauma, they're more likely sometimes to feel like they just have to go along with it and have to do their best and just accept the shitstorm that life is and submit to the powers that be. And you'll see that sometimes people just kind of give up and give power over to someone else because they don't think they're capable of dealing with the situation. So here I just wanted to touch base on 3 different mental health disorders that are associated with trauma. The one on the far left is a PTSD, the single event form of PTSD that we're talking about. And in those people, you're going to have a sense of threat, a persistent avoidance of stimulus associated with the traumatic events, intrusive, distressing memories or flashbacks. These are people that let's go back to the soldier example, and they come back home. The 4th of July is terror for many soldiers because it triggers their memories of the wartime zone they were in. Complex PTSD has those, some of the similar things to regular PTSD, but you'll see more affect dysregulation, which is mood disorder symptoms. They're going to have a lot more trouble regulating their emotions. They're more often going to have a negative self-concept, they've internalized these messages and these internalized beliefs about them being a bad person, they deserved this. And they're more likely to have problems in their relationships with other people. They're less likely to trust people, not necessarily because it's a physiological, neurological response, but also because they have that attachment wound there. And then just to throw on top of it, there's borderline personality disorder, which isn't because of necessarily just trauma. But we have seen those with BPD have a much higher rate of traumatic history in their early lives, especially before they were 15 years old. And this affects them long term, and it because they don't really understand their sense of identity as well because of all the tumultuous times in their youth. They will try to avoid abandonment, even if it's imagined. And then you can also get to the level of like disassociation and paranoia in those cases. So I'm going to be focusing a lot more on like complex PTSD and lowercase t traumas that happened in our younger years and affect us throughout our lives. This doesn't, I'm not necessarily talking about to the level of disorder. So these are the types of adverse childhood experiences, or in some fields, they'll say ACEs to refer to these, that can really leave long-term lasting impacts into children, especially in the realm of attachment. So there's the things we think about, like abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Yeah, those things make sense why they would leave lasting negative wounds. But neglect is a huge wound, especially if it's repetitive and throughout the younger years of life. And this is both physical neglect, like not getting enough food, not getting clean clothes, those kind of things. But it's also emotional neglect. And there's also then household dysfunction. You might have received all the emotional connection you needed. You might have received all the physical care you needed. No one abused you. But it was really hard to deal with your mother having bipolar disorder. Like you didn't see her attacking you or anything, but just being around that can be traumatic in a way. Incarcerated relatives, the mother being treated violently, substance abuse within the immediate family, divorce or separation. And this isn't about blaming parents for like destroying their children and youth. These things happen outside of parents' control all the time. This can be a coach at your school abused you. This can be like your mother had no say in how she was treated necessarily by other people, but you still witnessed that. Maybe she dealt with it very well, but you're still going to deal with issues from that experience. And going back to the neglect part, this is the one we don't talk about as much as being a trauma, and it really needs to be talked about, especially since we're talking about attachment. One of the invisible traumas that Jessica Fern, the author of Polyamorous, likes to talk about is the invisible trauma of the middle class. And, that tends to be the thing of you were overscheduled for activities as a youth, where you were always in some sort of academic or extracurricular activity. You had to get A+ grades all the time. You had to do your chores all the time. And you received all your physical needs, but you didn't, have that emotional connection with people around you. You didn't trust them emotionally. You trusted them to maybe take care of you physically. But you internalized a lot of the, like, if I don't do enough of these activities, if I don't get good enough grades, I'm worthless kind of thing. And that can be so insidious. So what are some of the results of these adverse childhood experiences we just talked about throughout life? All these things are more common for people who experience adverse childhood events and traumas. Some of these things make sense, but if you think about like STDs, for example, I know in the kink and poly communities, we are very big about like sexual responsibility, getting yourself tested more often if you're having frequent partners, negotiating those things, thinking it through a little bit more than some people do. But those who have like this insecurity based on those adversities in youth are less likely to think about, using a condom. They're more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors without thinking about the consequences. So many other presentations about attachment and trauma, wouldn't be necessarily aware of the fact that a good hard spanking might be self-care, or a good hard spanking, might be a good thing for you. So we think about these results as a little bit nuanced, more nuanced, I guess, is the way to think about it. But it's not just the mental, emotional things that will affect you throughout your life. It's these things affect you physiologically as well. Those who had adverse childhood experiences are more likely to experience heart disease. You're more likely to experience diabetes, severe obesity, COPD. And this goes back to the fact that, like, when you're experiencing toxic stress over and over and over again, you're producing a hormone called cortisol and other stress hormones, and they're never able to come back down to normal levels. And your body never comes back down to a regulated state. Instead, you're up all the time, and your body gets used to this. And when your body gets used to this, it starts to do things to cope in a not so good way, whether that's mentally or physiologically. So like if you have some of these things right now in your life, some of these, you've had suicide attempts, you've had a stroke or cancer, you smoke, you're like an alcoholic or something like that, maybe there's a reason. Maybe look a little farther back. And it doesn't necessarily have to be connected to childhood all the time. Sometimes it can be a later event in life that will cause these things. But most of the time, we're talking about before the age of 6. So going back to attachment styles, how do these different reactions to adversity and trauma in our life cause us to have a certain style? When I'm talking about this angle of attachment style, I like to think more to the 2 dimensions of attachment style, not necessarily the, I like to think to the dimensions of anxiety and avoidance, instead of talking necessarily about the 4 different types. Because let me use myself as an example. My mother was a single mother. She had to work very long hours to support us financially, and she also had a 2-hour commute each way to work. So I didn't really see her very much during the weekdays. Sometimes she even had to work on the weekends. And I love my mother very much, and I had a very deep attachment bond with my mother. But I never knew if she was going to actually be there physically in person. And she might say, "I'm going to be home all weekend," and then all of a sudden an emergency came up at work. So I became a little less reliant on deep attachment relationships. And I started to think, maybe I should just avoid relationships and connections because they're just going to hurt me. So I went high avoidance in my response to neglect and things in my youth. Then there's people who are high anxiety, which is, they're worried. They're always worried. They're always scared that something's going to happen. They're going to be too much for a person. That person's going to run away. And ideally, you'll have different levels of anxiety and avoidance depending on, what relationship you're in, what part of your life you're in, recent events. But you want to be kind of low-ish in anxiety, not too little anxiety, because then you're not stimulated enough by things around you. And you want to be relatively, low-ish avoidance, but not too low of avoidance, because then you might get enmeshed with someone who's not a good match for you, kind of thing. You need to be able to have that secure base within yourself where you aren't overextending and you aren't undergiving either. That balance, it's really hard. We talk more about that in the other classes too. So in Polysecure, Jessica Fern talks about her nested model of attachment and trauma. And I really like this model for talking about the different levels of experience within our lives and how it relates to attachment and trauma. So most of the time, you think of PTSD in a soldier. That's at the self level. They experienced something directly happening to them or around them, they witnessed it. That's the self level of attachment and trauma. And, you know, they might have some hard time with securely attaching to themselves after PTSD because they don't necessarily trust their brain anymore. But it's kind of internalized usually, from the mental side anyway. But you can experience attachment wounds and trauma issues in the home level, whether that's like the people you just lived with. Then there's the local communities and culture level. So like your church, your school culture, those catty ass bitches in middle school, that would be in this section. Then there's societal traumas, which are a little more broad. That's more like United States level. A lot of societies will have different reactions to different races. So like, I'll talk about the difference between a global trauma and a societal trauma. So a global or collective trauma, you could think of as maybe colorism. You know, generally in most countries throughout the world, the darker your skin complexion is, the
apparently Jaeger,
the more stigma, I guess, there is towards you, the less worthy you're deemed by the powers that be. And that is something you see in culture after culture, after society throughout the world. But on a societal level, there might be subtle differences. So that would be more like we are against, you know, not necessarily Mexican people, but Black people. Like even if they might be the same, you know, skin color, it's a different within one society, like a country or a continent kind of. An example of a global trauma that we're all struggling with and how it relates to attachment is COVID-19. We are all going through this. We're all, you know, having to think a little bit differently about how we connect to the world around us every day. And, you know, some of us are finding our connection and attachments online, through FetLife or through dating apps, through our group chats with our friends. But a lot of us have like a sense of paranoia now that, you know, even though we're getting vaccinated now, we're still having to like, oh wait, I can start thinking about hanging out with my friends again. Like, what? And we're just having to remind ourselves that like, it's really hard to not be able to connect with people when you're going through a trauma like COVID-19. We rely on people and our connections. So what can you do in your own life, your own relationships, to create a safe haven and secure base as an adult now? How can you heal from these attachment wounds, these traumas, these crises? And here's some ideas. If you take these questions to your partner, friend, best friend, parent, if you want, whoever you like are really close to, you really trust, these are some great questions to talk about. So if I turn towards you, will you be there for me? Can I rely on you? Will you receive and accept me instead of attack, criticize, dismiss, or judge me? Will you comfort me? So like, for example, in BDSM, we are very big about aftercare after a scene, after we do some tough play with each other. If someone denies our request for aftercare, especially if they do it in a dismissing, judging way, that does not create a safe haven. That does not create trust. And I'm not saying that, you know, every top is required to give aftercare to the bottoms they play with, but that needs to be negotiated. That, you know, you should be doing some sort of aftercare. You can give it to yourself. You don't necessarily have to have it with the person you're playing with. But if you don't comfort yourself, if you don't soothe yourself, soothe your nervous system, your emotions, your mind, that crisis mode will continue, whether it's just from the scene or whether it's a lifelong thing you're struggling with. Just simply asking, do I matter to you? And I really like this question for all types of relationships. It doesn't have to be romantic. It doesn't have to be sexual. Do I matter to you? Am I a friend? Like, am I important? Do I make a difference in your life? And can we lean into, can we rely on each other? That side of this slide is more safe haven. The other side, on the right side, is the secure base concepts. You want to listen to your partners talk about their other relationships. And that doesn't mean, always talk about things. Like, you need to have boundaries sometimes in certain relationships. You might not be able to hear about the gritty details of their gangbang the other night. But it's more about sharing your experiences and feeling supported in your interests, and having, emotionally and intellectually stimulating conversations with each other about your experiences and your ideas. These are all things you would do with a child to help them to develop a healthy self-concept and a healthy psyche moving forward through life. So think about, you need these things as adults too. And it doesn't have to be part of a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship. It can be, your service sub that comes over just once a week, and your friends, play partners, but that's about it. Offering words of encouragement when they're, learning a new skill to please the dom is important. You want to give that to them also so that they can give it back to you. If you practice these things, the more you practice them, the easier they come. The more you discuss them, the easier they come too. So just to kind of coalesce this into a little simpler from all those questions we just looked at, think about, what can I do in my relationships now to heal those attachment wounds? And here we have the acronym HEARTS, which was created by Jessica Fern. And it's about, being here, being in the present moment when you're together with someone, not being on your phone the whole time, sharing some memes back and forth when you're together, that might be good. But, being present with each other when you're together, expressing delight with each other. And you can still have this, even if, you're really much more into being really stern in times. Like, there's ways of doing these things within a different form. Like, if you are more into being a domineering, stern type, you can still express delight in that in a different way. I am really big into attuning with each other. And like, you see, the next one is our rituals and routines. There are rituals and routines that I love in kink and BDSM and poly that really get people to be more in tune with each other. For example, if you have a kind of ritual at the beginning of a scene where maybe it's about setting that intention of being in the present moment and attuning with each other. And I like to start using a specific breathing pattern when I start a scene, and locking eyes with the bottom and drawing them into that breathing pattern and getting us to the point where we're connected and attuned to each other's reactions on a physiological and mental level. This isn't just about making them feel safe and comforted and secure. It's also about, like, getting us to higher levels of pleasure too. Knowing what the limits are. Yes, you need to negotiate and know what limits are beforehand through verbal words. But if you're tuned to someone's body and their emotional state, whether that's throughout a scene, whether they're getting ready to go out on a first date with a new partner, being attuned to with their state can be really impactful, because sometimes they don't see themselves when they're having issues. And then if you see that and connect that with them, that can be really impactful. Rituals and routines. This kind of thinking about more like structure when you think about it from this angle. And a lot of people find monogamy relationships very secure because they rely on the structure of that relationship. And relying on a structure isn't always the best way to deal with things, whether that's monogamy or poly or kink or whatever. But building in rituals and routines with the people that are important to you allows a little bit of why structure feels so impactful, important to seep into your life without, being obsessed with, a hierarchical structure or something. This can be, I'm going to have a Netflix date over Zoom with my secondary partner every other week on Friday nights. Just having that routine can be really impactful. Turning towards people in conflict, asking for help, so hard to do, I know. But if you ask for help and turn towards each other in conflict, you start to trust them even more, and you start to trust yourself because you're asking for what you need. And then the most difficult one of all of these, secure attachment with self. I am not ever you're never going to hear me say that you can't be loved until you love yourself first. I hate that line. Hate it, hate it, hate it. If you don't love yourself, that doesn't mean you don't deserve love. But you are more likely to have secure, healthy attachments with other people if you have a secure, healthy attachment with yourself, and vice versa. So, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're not going to work on, loving yourself until you're in a stable relationship. But if you're, you can learn how to love yourself from another person sometimes. Just seeing how much unconditional positive regard they have for you sometimes can open your eyes and be really, really impactful. So think about the secure attachment with yourself thing. And let's go back to the safe haven and secure base slide. These questions were all geared towards like other people in your life, other different types of relationships. Think about this more from turning inward and trying to give yourself a safe haven and secure base with yourself. Do you matter to you? Do you care if you put yourself through pain and hardship? Do you think you deserve that? For example, having emotionally and textually stimulating conversations with each other. You can stimulate yourself in different ways and build that secure base through that. So embracing your creativity, embracing your imagination and writing and exploring your psyche or things like that, that will help you build a secure attachment with yourself. Not having a secure attachment with yourself is really essential. I'm not saying you can't have healthy relationships without this, but it will make your relationships harder if you don't have a secure attachment with yourself, if you don't address that aspect of it. Okay, so we're getting to the end, and I want to wrap this up with an exercise on self-compassion. So we can't control everyone around us. We can ask for help. We can ask for connections with people. We can do what we can. But you're more likely to have control over the level of self-attachment you have than necessarily the attachment you have with other people. And we all struggle and make mistakes and fuck up. And we have to be able to forgive ourselves and self-soothe so we can move through those things. So I want to wrap up today with a little bit of an exercise on self-compassion, and kind of thinking about how you can use this for returning to that secure base within yourself. And hopefully the video.
To survive in this high-pressured, crazy world, most of us have to become highly adept at self-criticism. We learn how to tell ourselves off for our failures and for not working hard or smart enough. But so good are we at this that we're sometimes in danger of falling prey to an excessive version of self-criticism, what we might call self-flagellation, a rather dangerous state which just ushers in depression and underperformance. We might simply lose the will to get out of bed. For those moments, we need a corrective. We need to carve out time for an emotional state of which many of us are profoundly suspicious: self-compassion. We're suspicious because that sounds horribly close to self-pity. But because depression and self-hatred are serious enemies of a good life, we need to appreciate the role of self-care in a good, ambitious, and fruitful life. To this end, we can perform what we've called a self-compassion exercise, a structured meditation lasting 15 minutes or so. Lying in bed, or perhaps a bath, turn over a sequence of thoughts that interrupt and correct the flow of your worst self-accusations. For a time, adopt an entirely kindly perspective on your setbacks. The self-compassion exercise goes like this. We're so in love with success, we fail to notice the scale of the challenges we routinely set ourselves. There is nothing remotely normal about what we've tried to achieve. We've failed, but given the mountain we were trying to climb, the conclusion doesn't have to be that we're simply fools. We have tricky family histories, we all do. There were things which happened to us at the hands of others which can help to explain some of our current troubles. We're not entirely sane or well, but none of us are. We weren't well set up to carry out certain tasks. It isn't wholly our fault in the here and now. From the media, you'd think everyone was rich and famous and successful. But in reality, undramatic, quiet failure is by a huge margin the statistical norm. We shouldn't tear ourselves apart for not managing to beat what were, in truth, awesome odds. Tough, self-critical people don't allow themselves the indulgence of believing in luck. They take responsibility for everything. They think winners make their own luck. But they don't, for the most part. Luck is a genuine feature of existence. We're robbing ourselves of fair consolation by believing that we're entirely in control and therefore entirely to blame when we crash. Scoundrel. You are not only your achievements. Status and material success are one bit of you, but there are others as well. Those who loved you in childhood knew this, and in their best moments helped you to feel it. Rehearse the internalized voices of all those who've been kind to you. Bathe in the memory of a love independent of achievement. It seems it will never end. That's not the truth. It's just how a crisis feels. You need to reduce expectations to zero for a time. Take each new hour as it comes. And, without being banal, what you need most of all is some rest.
Okay, so now that we've just ran through a quick exercise in self-compassion, I want you to hold on to those exercises in self-compassion And try to remember to do that for yourself, and try to be that secure base for yourself. So that is pretty much the end of today. Just a little bit on last thing. Our society tells us our relationships have to, be these certain ways in order to be healing, healthy, secure relationships. You have to have romantic date nights. You have to, do the escalator thing, have the first date, get closer, get engaged, move in together, get married, have children. You don't have to do that for them to be a secure relationship. What you need to do is heal from your past. Own your triggers, especially if you're doing kinky play related to your triggers or like traumatic stuff. Own your triggers, please. Please. Have hard conversations. Avoiding the hard conversations can be so bad for you, both internally and externally with the people in your life. If you want to learn more about attachment trauma, and maybe not necessarily consensual non-monogamy, but you just don't necessarily want to be fitting attachment and trauma into like a very narrow mononormative lens, Jessica Fern's book Polysecure is a great look into those things in a non-traditional lifestyle lens. She does use polyamory mostly as her example, but it's one of the few looks at attachment theory and trauma from a non-traditional lens, so it is pretty valuable in that sense. And we will be discussing that book further in Prepare and my mental health groups block. We are still being recorded. I have a couple minutes before 3 p.m., so I'm going to open the floor for questions. But if you do have a question, please realize you're being recorded. If you have a question that you would not want to be recorded for, you can wait. At 3 p.m., we're going to stop recording and we're going to open up discussion groups. So if there are questions, I can take those. Okay, babe or Betty?
Yeah, I was just wondering if this presentation could be downloaded or somewhere, or if we could see it somewhere online.
Yes. So I have recorded it so that people can look at it later. I'm going to be posting the link in our Telegram chat groups for that we look at this book. But if you, how did you find out about this class?
I went through FetLife.
Okay, so I will add a link to the recording on a Google Drive folder to the event that was for today on FetLife. So that way you can go to the event page and click on that link, and then you can download the presentation.
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah, that sounds good. I just thought it was so great with those questions that you said first, that those were questions you could ask for other relationships, and then you just kind of took a turn and it could be questions to ask yourself.
Made it harder.
I would like to actually write them down somewhere in some kind of notebook to look at every now and
then. Okay, perfect. I will make sure to do that. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk about this stuff with you guys. I talk about this stuff all the time in my academia classes and from an education perspective, but it's really nice to bring the perspective of non-traditional relationships and alternative lifestyles.